Hello, my name is Nina Kasamatsu from the American School in Japan, and today I will be presenting my research on Japan's ambitious national policy to reduce cedar pollen. This policy was introduced in response to a growing public health and economic crisis, one driven largely by the country's expansive cedar forests. The focus of my research is to evaluate whether this large-scale environmental plan is both economically feasible and strategic in its resource allocation. To understand the urgency behind this policy, we need to look at the health issue at its core. Allergic rhinitis is a chronic allergic condition that causes cold-like symptoms such as sneezing, nasal congestion, itchy eyes, and a runny nose. The seasonal form of this condition is more commonly known as hay fever. In Japan, the primary cause of hay fever is pollen from Japanese cedar and cypress trees. Today, over 1/3 of Japan's population suffers from cedar pollen-induced hay fever. Beyond its significant public health implications, hay fever caused by pollen also has major economic consequences. By 2025, it is projected to cause an annual economic loss of 14 trillion yen, primarily due to reduced workplace productivity. Additional contributing factors include increased healthcare costs and consumer spending losses. Currently, about 70% of Japan's land area, approximately 37.79 million hectares, is covered by forests. Of this, roughly 10.09 million hectares are artificial or planted forests, making up around 40% of Japan's total forest area. Among these planted forests, Japanese cedar or sugi and cypress or hinoki trees dominate, accounting for nearly 70% of planted trees. That means Japan is home to approximately 4.4 million hectares of cedar trees alone. This is a scale equivalent to 57 times the land area of Tokyo. Japan's cedar crisis has its origins in post-World War II reconstruction efforts. After World War II, Japan urgently needed to rebuild its infrastructure. In response, the government launched a massive afforestation campaign, planting millions of fast-growing cedar trees for domestic timber production. Japanese cedar was favored due to its rapid growth and suitability for Japan's climate. While this policy addressed urgent economic needs at the time, it has had unintended long-term consequences. Cedar trees begin releasing peak levels of pollen after about 30 years, and today, over 50% of Japan's planted forests are now older than 50 years. This program created vast monoculture forests that now release excessive amounts of pollen each spring, fueling the country's hay fever crisis. In response to this, in 2023, the Japanese government announced a comprehensive plan to reduce the prevalence of pollen-induced allergies. This plan is structured around three main pillars. First off, source control, which is the reducing of production of pollen at its origin. Secondly, dispersion control, which is preventing pollen from spreading. And lastly, exposure control, which is reducing symptoms or exposure among individuals. However, budget allocations are heavily skewed. The government has designated approximately 6 billion yen annually for source control, while dispersion control receives only about 15 million yen, and exposure control receives a negligible amount. My research focuses specifically on the economic justification and efficiency of the source control pillar. Source control refers to efforts that reduce pollen at its origin, namely Japan's cedar forests. This includes accelerating the logging of mature cedar trees and replanting the land with low pollen or pollen-free species. The policy follows a cyclical approach often summarized as harvest, utilize, replant, and tend. The holistic cyclical approach needs to be in place to activate and sustain the forestry industry. In order to accelerate logging and replanting, demand for cedar timbers needs to be expanded, and productivity of forestry workers needs to be improved, and there should be enough supply of low or no pollen seedlings to regenerate the forest. The government has set ambitious long-term targets. It aims to reduce pollinating cedar forests by 20% in the next 10 years. It also plans to achieve a 50% or half reduction of pollinating cedar trees in 30 years. According to the study conducted by the Ministry of the Environment, there's a significant correlation between the amount of pollen dispersed and the number of allergy cases. Hence, it is assumed that pollen production will decrease in similar proportion to the reduction in cedar forests. So, in that sense, a 20% reduction in cedar forests in 10 years is expected to lower pollen levels by about 20% as well. The aim of this research is to assess the economic credibility of Japan's cedar pollen reduction policy by analyzing its costs in relation to its projected economic benefits. Ultimately, this study seeks to answer the central question: is the Japanese government's cedar reduction plan economically feasible? By doing so, it also aims to inform future policy decisions on balancing public health goals with sustainable resource management. To evaluate economic feasibility, this research draws on publicly available data from two primary government and corporate sources. First being reforestation costs that were obtained by the National Forestry Agency under Japan's Ministry of Agriculture. The second being economic loss projections related to hay fever, which were sourced from a study conducted by Panasonic Corporation. To assess the feasibility of Japan's 30-year cedar reduction plan, I constructed an economic model using data from government and corporate sources. The model demonstrates the projection of the speed of policy implementation and the economic loss associated with hay fever. 3 policy scenarios were modeled to evaluate outcomes at different speeds of implementation with specific target speed for the next 10 years. The first being the baseline, which is the policy goal which is supposed to be reached in 30 years by accelerating the speed of pollinating cedar forests from 51,000 hectares per year in 2023 to 71,000 hectares per year in 2033, replanting with 90% of logged area with low pollen seedlings by 2033. Next is the accelerated scenario, which is the policy goal which is reached in 15 years, or at double the speed. And lastly, it's the delayed scenario, which is the policy goal which is reached in 60 years at half the speed. Here are the key cost variables that are included in my model. First being the logging cost, which is the total cost of logging, which includes both labor and technological investment, such as the use of advanced machinery and equipment. This assumes stable workforce levels due to successful recruitment and retention, with increased productivity supported by mechanization. The next variable being replanting costs, which is composed of labor and seedling expenses. This is based on the use of low pollen seedlings. Assumptions include a planting density of 3,000 trees per hectare, 5 times weeding, and 400 meters of wildlife protection fencing per hectare. The key assumptions made in my model are that forestry workers' wages and seedling costs remain constant throughout. Pollen dispersion decreases proportionally with cedar tree reduction, and that workforce size and productivity remain stable throughout the years. To model the scale of the government's investment in this ambitious policy, I modeled the annual economic loss from pollen-induced allergies and the total cost of policy execution. The results show that throughout all 3 scenarios, the total economic loss per year remains greater than the cost of the policy execution at any point over the next 30 years. This means that the sheer scale of economic loss induced from pollen allergies outweighs the extensive investment effort put in by the government. In the baseline scenario, even with a 50% pollen reduction by 2053, Japan still incurs 7.5 trillion yen in annual losses. Hardly a dramatic improvement. Furthermore, I conducted a cost-benefit analysis that models the cost, which is the cost of replanting policy and the annual economic loss, versus the benefits, which is the reduction in annual economic loss from policy implementation. This model helps identify the break-even point where policy costs are offset by economic gains. Within the government policy timeframe, the only timeline that exhibits a break-even point is the accelerated scenario, where the pace of policy execution is doubled. The accelerated scenario only reaches a break-even point in about 20 years' time after policy implementation begins. This does not account for the upfront investment until the break-even point has been reached. Even after reaching break-even, it would still take several more years before the benefits fully compensate for the cumulative cost of policy execution. Crucially, Since this is the accelerated scenario, for the government's stated plan to reach true break-even, they would have to wait double the time to see the fruits of this plan. While the source control policy is ambitious, several structural and economic challenges threaten its effectiveness. One being labor shortage. The number of forestry workers is steadily aging and declining, especially those involved in replanting and cultivation. Low income levels in the sector contribute significantly to this trend, raising concerns about whether there will be enough labor to support the long-term goals of cyclical forest management. Another being market imbalance for cedar timber. The demand for cedar timber used in construction is decreasing, while low-value uses like export logs and fuel chips are increasing. If cedar logging accelerates without boosting domestic demand, oversupply could drive prices down, making reforestation financially inviable for forest owners. Another being slow production of low-pollen seedlings. The policy aims for over 90% of cedar seedlings to be low-pollen within 10 years. However, current production capacity is far beyond this target. Scaling up will require clear strategies on which species to plant and how to balance cedar with other low-pollen alternatives. Potential negative impact on the environment is that there's a possibility of negative environmental impact from the accelerated deforestation, such as landslides, increased greenhouse gases, and disruption to biodiversity. While the study offers a preliminary economic assessment of Japan's cedar reduction policy, its findings must be interpreted with caution. One key limitation is the availability of long-term data. The policy has only been in effect for 2 years, leaving us much uncertainty about its full impact and implementation trajectory. That said, given the current projections and economic modeling, the scale of investment required by this reforestation plan appears difficult to justify, especially when the economic break-even point is decades away, and the primary stakeholders, such as forestry business owners and the general public, are unlikely to see direct benefits in the near term. Without a clear financial incentive for those driving the plan, sustained momentum and cooperation will be difficult to maintain. Instead, I propose investigating the reallocation of resources toward strategies that offer immediate impact and align incentives among counterparties. Specifically, greater investment should be directed towards dispersion control and exposure control measures. These include innovations in pharmaceuticals, allergy blocking technologies, and agricultural interventions, sectors where private companies such as pharmaceutical, chemical, and agricultural firms have both the capital and a vested interest in delivering effective solutions. Ultimately, for Japan to develop an economically and environmentally viable solution to its hay fever crisis, policies must balance long-term ecological goals with short-term economic realities. This requires aligning incentives among all stakeholders, the government, industry, and the public, while continuously monitoring and adjusting the policy as more empirical data becomes available. Thank you.